Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us for this very special program, the 39th Annual Presidential Lecture. This year, we are making it part of the university's 175th anniversary celebration this weekend. I also want to thank all of those who've provided us with those performances and presentations before the lecture program, the students, the faculty, the staff who shared their talents with us. And in particular, I'd like to thank Alan McVeigh, the director of the Division of Performing Arts, for organizing all of those incredible group talents, and David McCartney, the university archivist, who I'm told postponed his retirement in order to be involved in this event today. So we're really grateful to David, and yes, let's give them a special shout out, as well as the UI Library Special Collections for the fine historical exhibit in the lobby. You've all shown us the richness of the arts at Iowa, the richness of our history, and the richness of the talent we have here at the university. I also want to express my special gratitude to Gulrukh Mehboob, College of Public Health doctoral student who painted the beautiful watercolor of Old Capitol that graces the cover of today's program. And she's here today with her family, her 2 daughters and her husband, and I'm so grateful to all of them for this artistic talent they're sharing with us, on top of pursuing a doctoral degree in public health. So, the presidential lecture itself is a very important part of the university's history. It actually occurred or originated 39 years ago under the leadership of President James O. Friedman, who established that lecture. For nearly 4 decades now, the lecture has showcased outstanding faculty members from across the entire university. And they share their talents with us in a way that helps showcase everything we do and encourage communication across disciplinary boundaries, and they also bring the work of our faculty scholars to the general public, to the community. One of the strengths of the University of Iowa that I keep emphasizing, and I'll continue to emphasize, and one of the things that makes it so distinctive, frankly, is the institution's comprehensive excellence across the entire campus. Many of our peer institutions are weighted heavily towards certain disciplines. They're really strong in some areas, but not so strong in other areas. But what I love about the University of Iowa is that we are fortunate to have excellence across our disciplines, a really balanced portfolio of strengths. And you can see that balanced portfolio in the list of past lectures in your program. No one area dominates the past presidential lectures, and they range from nearly every discipline in the university, from literature to writing to law to music to political science to the health sciences to math to engineering to history and everything in between. When it came time to plan this year's presidential lecture, we wanted to do something special during the UI's anniversary. And so we decided that we would showcase the broad excellence of the university and that we'd explore both the proud past and the promising future of the institution. We decided to do that by choosing multiple lecturers. So this is a little unique this year, rather than a single person. And we would choose them from academic fields of special prominence at Iowa, those with long-standing histories of excellence. And of course, we wanted to choose incredible lecturers who would also represent the spirit of creativity and innovation and collaboration that exists here at Iowa. Outside of our Hawkeye athletic teams, if you asked Iowans what areas they think of when they think of the University of Iowa, I'm guessing many of them would say medicine, writing, and astronomy. Those would be near the top of many of their lists. And so today, we're really proud to present all 3 of those areas in our distinguished faculty members who are going to speak to us today. Craig Kletzing, the Donald A. and Mary B. Gurnett Chair in the Department of Physics and Astronomy in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. Christopher Merrill, Professor of English and Director of the International Writing Program in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and the Graduate College. And Patricia Winokur, Professor of Internal Medicine, Infectious Diseases, and Executive Dean of the Carver College of Medicine. All three of these highly accomplished faculty members have achieved significant prominence in their fields, and they've advanced the excellence of the university in very noteworthy ways. We've asked them to speak today about their work and their respective fields, with a special emphasis on the university's history as well as our future. You can read more about our lecturers' specific achievements in the biographies in your program. In advance of their lectures today, Iowa Magazine asked our three speakers to share how Iowa's strong historic contributions in their respective fields will help shape the future. So you can find out more about them there as well. Please pick up a copy on the way out in the auditorium, outside the auditorium today if you've not already received one. Today, our lecturers will speak in turn, and then I will moderate a brief discussion with all three at the end. We are so fortunate to have such nationally and internationally renowned and accomplished and inspiring and caring faculty members as our speakers today. I'm very honored to introduce this year's presidential lecturers, Craig Kletzke, Christopher Merrill, and Patricia Winokur. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Greg Howes. I am an associate professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy here at the University of Iowa. By training, I'm a theoretical plasma physicist, and I study the dynamics of space and astrophysical plasmas. Craig Kletzke is my valued colleague and collaborator. He is both an inspiration and a valuable leader in the field of space physics. Craig feels fundamentally that it's critical as a scientist not only to do groundbreaking research, but also to embrace fully the role of educator. He's a world-class scientist. He's doing activities and research really at the forefront of the field of space physics. But beyond that, he's just one outstanding individual. He plays in a rock band. He teaches students with a passion that you don't often see in world-class researchers. He has amazing demonstrations in his class. In one case, he actually had the University of Iowa's former president, Bruce Harreld, on a rocket-powered tricycle as an explanation of the thrust from rockets. He really captures the attention and inspires young students to learn more about physics. And his deep dedication to his students is clearly apparent in the way he approaches the teaching endeavor. I think Craig's greatest contribution, of course, the easy answer is the $115 million contract. But far more important and lasting than that is his impact on the students and researchers. They will be the scientists and leaders of the next generation. Those are the people that will look back and think about their days as an undergraduate or a graduate student at the University of Iowa, who were inspired and trained by Craig to be the best scientists and educators that they could be. So I think that's really his biggest contribution to the University of Iowa and to the United States as a whole.
Well, good afternoon, folks. Thank you all for coming, and I thank the president and the organizers of this event, because I think these presidential lectures are really quite marvelous. What I'd like to tell you a little bit about is space science at the University of Iowa. That's my discipline. I'm actually an experimental space plasma physicist. But this all started here at the University of Iowa. So if we go to our first slide, I thought I would start with James Van Allen. This is literally the beginning of space science in the world, in my opinion. In 1958, actually, end of 1957, the Russians put this satellite up called Sputnik. And it flew over the United States and really put people in quite a panic. I mean, how can the Soviet Union be putting a thing that's orbiting over our heads all the time? And so there was a lot of excitement there about what are we going to do? Well, it turned out Van Allen had been doing cosmic ray research at the University of Iowa. He came here in the early 50s. He'd been at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, where he'd been working on proximity fuses in the Second World War. And he was very interested in cosmic rays as a physicist. And the problem with that is he couldn't get high enough with just a regular rocket. So they started building these things called raccoons. And you can see him holding the rocket there. Up there, you can see the balloon that they would put the rocket on. The balloon would go up higher, and then the rocket would launch off and go. And they mostly did these from sea, as you can see from where he's there. Looking for my pointer. Here we go. So you can see that he's getting ready to go. And so there were lots of adventures putting these things up. But what it meant was when Sputnik flew, he suddenly had the opportunity to fly on a satellite, and they were looking for anybody who had an instrument that was sufficiently rugged to go into space, and he did have one. And so that became the instrument that was put onto Explorer 1. If we go to the next slide, we have the sort of the apocryphal photo here of the Pickering, von Braun, and Van Allen standing together. And this is actually a model of Explorer 1. So satellites in those days were a heck of a lot smaller than they are today. And this was, I think, just shortly after it had been launched, and they're showing off that they had a great success. But this was an instrument. They actually measured things. Sputnik did not. It was just a little, went boop, boop, basically, when it went over. So this was a big deal to actually measure something in space. And I like the picture here on the right because Van Allen, of course, in the middle, but that guy on the right is Carl McElwain, who was my PhD advisor at the University of California, San Diego. So I actually have a connection back to Iowa from the very beginning, although I had no idea I would ever end up here. And so, this was really the beginning of the field. And what they discovered was, in the next slide, was the radiation belts. And so I've got a couple of different pictures here of these, but it turns out, and it took a few missions before they got this completely defined, that there were two radiation belts. There's an inner belt and an outer belt. The pictures on the right-hand side here show the two different belts a little bit more clearly. The inner belt turns out to be really, really energetic protons, of all things, and they can punch right through things, so there's a lot of concern about what that environment is like because various space assets fly in that region that look down on the Earth by various agencies who usually don't talk about what they do very much. And so we've studied that, and then the outer belt is the electron belt, and that's very energetic electrons, and that turns out to be probably more important for most of you all because that's where the communication satellites sit that bring you things like CNN or any of the various cable television feeds come in from out there in that outer belt. And so this was discovered by Van Allen back in the 50s, and late 50s. And what's interesting is then they would do they would put a satellite up like every couple or 3 months, but they were very simple satellites. They've gotten a little more complicated. The picture that you see here is of the satellites called originally the radiation belt storm probes, and then that became the Van Allen probes. It was a pair of satellites that we launched back in 2012 to study this. They're the best instrumented satellites that have ever gone to the radiation belts and made spectacular measurements and confirmed all kinds of things and got us all kinds of new science that we had never had before. And really fantastic. They got renamed about 3 months after launch to the Van Allen probes. NASA likes to wait till they're up and working before they name them after people, oddly enough. Kind of a smart move that way. And so we got a lot of really good measurements, and I was a principal investigator for one of the experiments on here. In our next slide, we move on, and I wanted to talk a little about, I sort of started with this, late 50s, early 60s, and then on through the 90s, mission after mission after mission. And really the intent of this slide is not to read off every name up there. There's too many of them. I can mention a few of the key ones. Pioneer and Voyager, which are the satellites that have gone the furthest out of any objects that the humans have sent away from our planet. And in fact, the Voyagers are still alive and have now gone actually outside what we would call the formal solar system and are making measurements out, getting into what we call the interstellar medium. And just, spectacular measurements in satellite after satellite. Maybe I should mention Hawkeye, of course, which was built here at Iowa. In our next slide, what I can show you is what's some of the more recent things that we've been doing. And again, this is mostly since 2000, and we're still, as you can see, just a ton of stuff going on. And from more satellite missions, things like Cassini and various other missions, as well as Juno and the radiation belt storm probes, and I'll talk about some of these others. We also do a lot of sounding rockets, and that's what this picture is here on the right-hand side. That's a pair of sounding rockets that we launched in 2018 from Norway, a place called Andenes, and it turns out a great place to go investigate the cusp. We didn't actually launch them like that right next to each other. Again, NASA gets a little nervous about doing things like that because if there's some problem, if two rockets are going at once, you can't bring them back. These are what we call suborbital rockets. So that's actually a superimposed one, and then the other one went about 2 minutes later. But it was a great mission, and actually it led to what I'll be talking about in just a moment, which is our tracers mission. And so this is stuff that's just happened in the last couple of decades. Tons and tons of stuff that we've been measuring and various missions and so forth. Our next slide brings us to what I like to think of as sort of the Don Gurnett legacy. Sadly, Don Gurnett passed away last month, quite a surprise to many of us. But his group measured waves for decades, and a lot of key measurements about waves that we see in space. And so the group continues on. Voyager 1 and 2 are still traveling outbound and still making measurements. They send the data back very slowly, but they still make measurements. And then Juno, which was actually led by Bill Kurth in Don's group, that's orbiting around Jupiter and still sending data back. And then, of course, other missions that we've got going on here, too. The Van Allen probes were ended about 2 years ago, but we collaborated, my group and the Gurnett group, to build the experiments that are on there and made all these fantastic measurements of the radiation belts. And then the Viper sounding rocket has been led by George Hospodarsky, also in that group, and Cassini, they're still looking at the data. And so that group continues, and we continue the work that Don Gurnett started many years ago, and we're glad to see that continue to go on. So on the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit about what I do. So as I said, I'm an experimental space plasma physicist. I've done various different kinds of things over the years, mostly building particle detectors, but also with this Van Allen probes, we built the wave detectors. And so I've been involved with things like you see on top there, the radiation belt storm probes, renamed the Van Allen probes, the magnetospheric multiscale mission, which was launched in 2015 and is still returning data to this day. Very exciting mission looking at the fine details of a process called magnetic reconnection. And then sounding rockets, I put a picture of what a sounding rocket sort of looks like in a mechanical drawing that you can see there. And then another interest of mine for many years has been laboratory plasmas. And this is because when we make measurements with satellites, you sort of get what you get. There are no knobs that you get to turn to change the conditions in space. So you try to build up a picture by looking at various different conditions and so forth, but you can't actually say, I'm going to change this parameter and see if things behave the way I'd like them to. And so we build up theories, and they seem to explain things pretty well, but the advantage of going to a laboratory plasma is you actually have knobs that you can turn. So you can actually change things and say, does my theory match up? And so in that lower corner there on the right is a picture from the Large Plasma Device at UCLA. They use the acronym LAPD, which interestingly enough keeps odd people from wandering into their lab. Surprising, isn't that? And, but we've collaborated with them for a couple of decades, and actually Greg Howes, who gave that that wonderful introduction, I should say, it makes me feel almost embarrassed, I've collaborated with me on this stuff, and he's actually taken over most of this work these days. And so that's turned out to be very productive in sort of verifying theories of how space plasmas work. Now, on our next slide, I think I have to talk a little bit here about our tracers mission. We got selected for this a couple of years ago, and this is led by the University of Iowa. We do everything. It's a 2-satellite mission. We're going to go to this place called the Earth's cusp, and I'll show you that in a little more detail here in just a moment. These 2 satellites fly in exactly the same orbit, following one after the other as they go around. These satellites are, not too big, well, like some large washing machine or something like that. And we do everything, soup to nuts, except for the launch. We actually proposed originally to do the launch, but then NASA said, well, we're going to go ahead and do that launch for you because they didn't really want us to deal with acquiring a launch vehicle. But other than that, we buy this contract to get the satellite buses, we would call it, built with the vehicle that we go on, all the instruments that go on, all the science that gets done at the end, bringing all the data down, all that is done here with our partners at many other institutions, and I'll show you that in a moment. But this is our big mission that we'll be working on when we launch in 2024. If we go to the next slide, I can show you just a little bit about what the science is. So what I'm showing here is a picture of the Earth and its magnetic field. So you can see the Earth there on the lower left-hand side, and the magnetic field of the Earth is very much like a bar magnet that if you've ever played with those and you put some iron filings down, something I did in class just in the past week from the class I'm teaching. But there's an interesting process that happens, and you can see it called reconnection, where it's sort of lit up in orangish colors there. And what happens is the Earth's magnetic field points upward when you get out towards the side here. And then there's coming in from the left-hand side is what's called the solar wind. Stream of particles coming from the sun, and it carries the sun's magnetic field with it. And what happens when it is pointing downward and the Earth's magnetic field is pointing upward, you can kind of break each of those, what we call field lines, and then you can connect them together in a different way, and then they gradually stream backwards, and now the sun's magnetic field is connected to the Earth's magnetic field, and it lets in a whole bunch of particles. And so this magnetospheric multiscale mission I was talking about is studying the fine details about how does that breaking of field lines and stuff actually happen. But what we're going to do with our tracers mission is going to go to low Earth orbit, which is what's shown in the upper circle here. And you can kind of see where that comes in. There's sort of a funnel shape that comes down towards the Earth, and that's what we call the cusp. And it acts almost like a television screen of what's going on that comes zooming down these magnetic field lines. And so that's where we're going to go look with our mission. And we're complementary in that this mission that I said, the magnetospheric multiscale mission, it studies the fine details, but it's just there for a few seconds, and then it moves away. And so they can never tell, is reconnection happening at other places? Is it turning on or off? Because they just see it when they see it. And when we're flying down where we are, we can see it vary. And that's what we're going to look at and answer some long-standing questions. In our next slide, I show you a little bit about what our standard goals are. And the goal is really to look at this question of, is it temporally varying in time, or is it varying spatially? And are we just seeing things as we fly through, we're just going through different regions that connect up? And that's kind of our main goal, and it breaks up into these three sub-objectives. I'm not going to go through all of those. I just have to put this up because NASA likes us to show things like this. But this is the kind of the key thing that they're expecting us to do. My next slide, though, lets me show you what the spacecraft actually looks like in a little bit more detail, and all the various people that are involved. So we actually have quite a big team with several other institutions. We've got the University of California, Berkeley. We've got Lockheed out in California. We've got University of California, Los Angeles, providing instruments for us. We've got Southwest Research Institute in Texas providing instruments, and our project manager, Ron Black, is there. We have our theory lead is Professor Yu Lin, her simulations are some of the best in the world for the kind of stuff that we're looking at. We have colleagues at Colorado and at Dartmouth that are collaborating with us as well. So we have quite a widespread team to study all of this stuff. And then you can see the satellite here, and sort of going around it in, I'll go counterclockwise in the top, is our ion instrument. It measures positively charged particles. Then we come to our magnetometer that measures the magnetic field. And we actually will have a ride along with us, but I didn't put it in this slide because I'm not building it. And then we have our electric field experiment, which puts booms out and measures the electric field. And then we have our main electronics box. Not too exciting, it's just a box with a bunch of connectors that you plug in. Then we have our electron instrument, which is being built here at the University of Iowa. And then we have our magnetic search coil, which is also being built here at the University of Iowa. And like I say, this spacecraft's about the size of maybe a large washing machine, and kind of octagonally shaped, and there's solar cells around the outside, and so forth. And so this is our big mission. We expect to launch in 2024, as I said, and we're really looking forward to getting this up into space. So for the next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about our department. So I'm charged with telling you not only the past and where I'm going, but also where our department is going. And so I mentioned Professor Phil Carrot here and Jasper Hallekas. Phil's been a full professor for a while. Jasper is just in the process and will get promoted there. He's just waiting for the regents to say yay, which I'm sure they will. And both have been involved with all kinds of different things. Phil is primarily an astronomer, astrophysicist, and he built a small satellite called a CubeSat that flew about 5 years ago now, I guess. And then Jasper's involved with a whole variety of different things, including our tracers mission, where he's building one of the instruments. And he's also involved with a whole series of other projects that he just got a new one, actually, working on something called Helioswarm, which will launch in just, several years from now. And these guys have been doing this for a while, and they're continuing to just be really excellent. But let me tell you, what excites me in many ways the most is our young faculty. And so on the next slide, I talk about two of the people that do the kind of work I do, Allison Janes and David Miles. And Allison is working on sounding rockets, and she's got what's called an NSF Career Award, which is a big deal. In fact, Allison can't be here today because she's up in Alaska trying to launch a sounding rocket as we speak. Well, actually, probably not as we speak. She's probably sleeping right now because they do that stuff at night. Very, very active, also involved with the radiation belt storm probes and this MMS, magnetospheric multiscale mission I was talking about as well. So a valued colleague. David Miles comes to us and builds what are called flux gate magnetometers and has basically rediscovered or reinvented technology that's been lost for the past 40 years and is building these. And so NASA, as a strategic investment in making sure that our nation maintains the ability to build this kind of instrument, has invested in him, and he will be flying with us on the Tracers mission. He's what we call a technology demonstration mission, or instrument. And then the next slide talks a little bit about our astronomy professors here, which is Carrie Hoadley and Casey DeRue, and these guys are doing gangbusters as well. Both are involved with various different missions. As you can see, Carrie's involved with the Astra mission and these other ones as well, Casey as well, and both have received these prestigious Roman grants to develop young PIs and to develop new technology that you need to do the next generation of instruments. And so it's really spectacular to have these young faculty. It makes one feel quite warm that we've got a good, strong future. So just to wrap up here, next slide lets me just sort of summarize this kind of thing. That this is where it started, and this is where it's going to continue to go. We've got a great investment. The university has helped us with all of these things. But most important to me is we've invested in these young faculty, and we really have a great future coming. In fact, I'm reminded of I'll paraphrase a line from a song when I was in graduate school, and I'll end with that to say, our future's so bright, we got to wear shades. Thanks.
I'm Ed Folsom, Roy J. Carver Professor of English at the University of Iowa. I've been here for many decades now and been involved in a lot of major appointments at the university, and one that I've been proudest of is Christopher Merrill as Director of the International Writing Program. Chris is a guy who is always on the move. He has been to at least half the countries, probably more, in the world. He's always traveling somewhere exotic, far away, and he carries on his friendships and his correspondence and his own writing in transit. He's always alert to what's around him. I've been reading his most recent book, Flares, a book of prose poems that come from all kinds of places. They're all one-page long prose poems. And in one of the poems, we get the image of a parachutist whose parachute has malfunctioned, and he's on the way to the earth, and he knows this is the end. And what he does is he looks around himself, and we get this amazing catalog of what he sees. And then his life doesn't flash before his eyes, but instead what we end with is one image of him thinking back to a day he had gone to the zoo. And he comes home and his mother fixes him a peanut butter sandwich and some apple cider. And she lights a cigarette and she says, "Did you see anything interesting today?" And I'm haunted by that particular prose poem because for me, that question, did you see anything interesting today, defines all of Chris's writing. You can read all of his writing as the answer to that question. What did you see interesting today? He's always jotting it down. He's always composing it. Day after day, country after country, interactions with writers around the world. He's continually challenging other writers to respond to him, challenging himself to respond to them, and ending up with this amazing collection of writing. Because as director of the International Writing Program, he's been yearly bringing in between 25 and 35 writers from around the world. Over the years, over the decades, we're talking hundreds of international writers. And then Chris has worked with the State Department. He was appointed by Barack Obama to the National Council on the Humanities, served on the U.S. National Commission for UNESCO. That commission with UNESCO and his work with UNESCO allowed Chris to put together an astonishing application to make Iowa City the first recognized UNESCO City of Literature. You know, the rest really is history. I've never known anyone with the kind of energy level that Chris brings, not only to his job and to his writing, but to his life, to living his life day by day. Did you see anything interesting today? That's Chris's question to himself as well as to all of us.
Wow. I'm very grateful to you for choosing to spend this afternoon with me and with Professors Klitzing and Winokur. To John Keller, Bruce Harold, and others responsible for arranging this event. To President Barbara Wilson, whose inauguration as the University of Iowa's 22nd president we celebrate, along with the institution's 175th anniversary. And to my dear friend Ed Folsom, whose own presidential lecture about Walt Whitman informs much of my thinking. His kind words on my behalf may explain why his friends and colleagues hope he will outlive us so that he might speak at our memorial services. So to Ed, I say, long life and thank you. The title of my lecture, Tell It Slant, comes from a poem that Emily Dickinson wrote sometime between 1858 and 1865, a decade or so after the University of Iowa was founded. This was a decisive period in American history, echoes of which regularly sound today. And this poem, conceived in a time of bitter division, when it was difficult to sort out the truth among conflicting accounts of events and derive meaning from the waves of grief and joy that washed over Americans during the Civil War, speaks to a fundamental issue of this democratic enterprise: how to create and preserve spaces for truth-telling, since this is integral to our experiment in liberty. And the poem goes like this: tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies, too bright for our infirm delight. The truth's superb surprise, as lightning to the children eased with explanation kind. The truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. Dickinson's eyesight declined during the war, which adds a layer of personal meaning to the last line of the poem. And who among us has not suffered from the blinding light of truth, especially when it is delivered unexpectedly? You might say the cornerstone of this writing university is the truth's superb surprise, the kinds of discovery occasioned by a rhyme, a metrical imperative, a turn of phrase, the demands of a plot, or the development of a character that poets and writers may experience as a quickening of the pulse, an acceleration of thought, a deepening of perspective. This is what we live for, to work in the language to enlarge our understanding of the world, broaden our sympathies, learn something new. Poets and playwrights, novelists and nonfiction writers, journalists and filmmakers all engage in different forms of truth-telling, which is a precondition for the liberty of conscience enshrined in our founding documents. A republic of letters is thus essential to the life of the republic, which depends upon a citizenry capable of distinguishing truth from falsehood. A civic education, then, may be bolstered by creative individuals who choose to serve apprenticeships in literary forms of truth-telling, the fruits of which include an expanded community of readers and writers who not only may have a better appreciation of the delights on offer in a vivid poem or short story, but an enhanced ability to discern the truth, which in an age of rampant disinformation, #fake news, is critical to the survival of democracy. Ernest Hemingway said, "The most essential gift for a good writer is a built-in shock-proof shit detector." This is the writer's radar, and all great writers have had it. Iowa graduates have cultivated that gift for more than a century, which is why Iowa City was the first UNESCO City of Literature to be designated in the New World. Needless to add that literary truths come in a wide array of guises, from straight reportage to surrealist juxtapositions to hybrid forms mixing prose and poetry, technological advances and teleological narratives, and a seemingly infinite range of creative expressions in between. When lightning strikes, writers summon all that they know and much that they do not know in order to dazzle their readers gradually with truths that may change their lives. In the early 1990s, while reporting from the war zones of the former Yugoslavia, I often heard an adage attributed to the Prussian military theorist Klaus von Clausewitz: "In war, truth is the first casualty." For propaganda reigns in the fog of war. Facts about troop movements, battles, and strategy are in continual dispute, and it is easy to fall into the trap of imagining that one knows more than one does. Whenever I felt I was losing perspective, the first sign was usually hearing myself parrot an argument from one side of the conflict or another. I resolved to travel to the other side as soon as possible. Suffice to say that Vladimir Putin's justification for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which depends on a false narrative of Ukrainian history, has brought back many interviews I conducted in the former Yugoslavia with people from all walks of life who used flawed histories to justify atrocities committed by their countrymen. Beware of anyone who claims to have history on their side. Here is something we can all agree on, the Serbian-American poet Charles Simic writes: "Sooner or later, our tribe always comes to ask us to agree to murder." This is why he believes that lyric poets, quote, "perpetuate the oldest values on earth. They assert the individual's experience against that of the tribe," close quote. What a literary education can inspire is a lifelong search for new ways to express those oldest values on earth. The shock that Ukrainians felt this week when Russian forces invaded their country was surely similar to what Sarajevans felt when their Serbian countrymen besieged the city just 8 years after it had hosted the Winter Olympics, or what New Englanders felt when Fort Sumter was shelled. It is not as difficult as you might think for a political leader skilled in the darker arts of persuasion to convince some element of his citizenry to think tribally. The courageous Serbian journalist Miloš Vasić, founding editor of an independent weekly in Belgrade, Vreme, explained in a memorable fashion his countrymen's support for what the International Criminal Court at The Hague would prosecute as crimes against humanity. All it took was a few years of fierce, reckless, chauvinistic, intolerant, expansionist, warmongering propaganda to create enough hate to start the fighting among people who had lived together peacefully for 45 years. You must imagine a United States with every little TV station everywhere taking exactly the same editorial line, a line dictated by David Duke. You too would have war in 5 years. His prediction was borne out by the January 6th insurrection, and I trace my fascination with different forms of truth-telling, each of which can contribute to a greater understanding of our walk in the sun, not only to what I have witnessed in war zones from the Balkans to Iraq and Afghanistan, but to the growing divisions in our own country. It is difficult to get the news from poems, William Carlos Williams wrote in Asphodel, that greeny flower, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there. What we offer in this UNESCO City of Literature are instructions, space, and time for discovering what is found there. It turns out that the Iowa Writers' Workshop was not the world's first degree-granting creative writing program. That distinction belongs to the Maxim Gorky Institute, Literary Institute in Moscow, which was founded in 1933. Joseph Stalin's bid to create a new species of human being, Soviet poeticus, coincided with the Soviet-engineered famine in Ukraine, the Holodomor, which led to the deaths of nearly 4 million people, the first methodically planned genocide, in this case by starvation, in the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. This was the same year that Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany, marking the beginning of the Third Reich, which would sign a non-aggression pact with Soviet Union to divide up Poland. Here in the heartland, the idea of fostering creativity, seeded by Dean Carl Seashore's decision in 1922 to grant graduate credit for creative work, would transform the landscape of American higher education. The workshop was established in 1936 in the midst of a devastating drought, a plague of grasshoppers, and the continuing misery of the Great Depression. This was hardly a propitious moment to launch such a radical program, but the history of ideas suggests that it is precisely at such dark moments that humankind may rise to the challenge and effect momentous change. Surely we have arrived at such a moment with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It was also in 1936 that Paul Engel, the son of a horse trader in Cedar Rapids and one of the first recipients of the MA degree in creative writing, took his honeymoon in Moscow and Berlin. It is tempting to imagine that his tenure as the workshop's longest-serving director and co-founder of the International Writing Program was shaped by what he witnessed abroad. In Berlin, for example, a Jewish bookseller gave him several fine editions by the German poet Rainer Maria Rilke and asked him to help his teenage daughter escape from Germany. Engel's letter to the bookseller was returned, stamped "disappeared," a failure that haunted him. He went on to help writers at every stage of their career, some of whom were in grave danger. I am happy to report that the International Writing Program continues to offer safe haven to writers at risk, most recently from Myanmar and Afghanistan. And we have reached out to Ukrainian alumni of our fall residency and summer writing program for high school students, holding them in our thoughts and prayers, even as we prepare to seek places for them to live in safety. The workshop model pioneered at Iowa, a literary apprenticeship rooted in the promise of democratic access central to public education, has spawned hundreds of undergraduate and graduate creative writing programs here and abroad, proving to be far more productive than what was on offer at the Gorky Institute, which inspired no imitations in the Soviet Union. With the demise of the Soviet Union, the number of creative writing programs doubled in the Russian Federation, one less than the 3 MFA creative writing programs in this state alone. The innovative Iowa idea to bring together artists and scholars in an academic setting succeeded wildly beyond what anyone might have imagined in the Roaring '20s, the Great Depression, and World War II. The Polish poet Wisława Szymborska declared in her Nobel address that, quote, inspiration is not the exclusive privilege of poets or artists generally. There is, has been, and will always be a certain group of people whom inspiration visits. It's made up of all those who've consciously chosen their calling and do their job with love and imagination. It may include doctors, teachers, gardeners, and I could list 100 more professions. Their work becomes one continuous adventure as long as they manage to keep discovering new challenges in it. Difficulties and setbacks never quell their curiosity. A swarm of new questions emerges from every problem they solve. Whatever inspiration is, it's born from a continuous, I don't know. This is the stance I take not only in my writing, but in my prognostications about the future of writing at Iowa, which boasts the nation's top-ranked programs in poetry, fiction, nonfiction, and undergraduate creative writing. I cannot predict what literary forms and genres will dominate, though I imagine hybridity will continue to shape some of the most interesting work. But I can say with some confidence that poets and writers will explore issues of identity, immigration, social justice, Black Lives Matter, climate change, income disparities, the clash between democratic and autocratic forms of government, love and loss. We live in a complicated historical moment, and if the role that writers play may seem peripheral to the business and political classes, we also know that what is marginal today may be central tomorrow. Emily Dickinson, for example, who was all but unknown at the time of her death in 1886. Our inner lives are immeasurably richer thanks to the 1,789 discoveries she made, including this little poem, which might be emblazoned on the Welcome to Iowa signs on this side of the Mississippi. To make a prairie, it takes a clover and one bee, one clover and a bee, and reverie. The reverie alone will do if bees are few. And bees are dying off from various environmental factors, including pesticides, drought, and habitat devastation. Hence, environmental concerns will loom large in what writers address from here on out. After all, we are gathered today in the rebuilt Hampshire Auditorium, which was destroyed in the Great Flood of 2008. The floodwaters had begun to subside when I dialed into a World Wildlife Federation conference call, during which a climatologist remarked that if present trends continued, 500-year floods would become regular occurrences. This suggests that one strand of the vibrant tradition of American nature writing will surely flourish, the marriage of scientific insight and literary sensibility that one finds in our fellow Iowan Aldo Leopold's famous book, Sand County Almanac. The last 7 years have been the hottest on record. Wildfires are now a staple of the evening news in every season, and we know about floods. If early in my tenure at the IWP, writers rarely mentioned climate change, now it is a commonplace for them to discuss it, for no one will escape the ravages of a warming planet. During the flood of 2008, we launched Between the Lines, a summer program for high school students from Arab-speaking countries, which we had to relocate at the last minute to Chicago. We had hired an IWP alumna, Iman Humayedin, a Lebanese novelist who had lived through a 15-year-long civil war in her country. And one day she asked me how it felt to have devoted so much of my writing life to covering conflicts abroad, only to have disaster strike in my backyard. Weird, I replied. Get used to it, she said. To be born in a time and a place is not to join in a national destiny, the historian Timothy Snyder recently observed. In a commentary on the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, independence must be declared again and again, generation after generation, individual by individual. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the work of writers, who must not only master the art and craft of their chosen genre, but declare their independence from their literary masters, the writers who first inspired them to take pen to paper. Freedom is made, not born, Snyder concludes, to which I would add, it is grounded in an unwavering determination to tell the truth, which is why the movement to restrict the teaching of history is an anathema to writers. Here is how we know truth-telling is critical to a democracy. Book banning is back in vogue. Art Spiegelman's graphic novel about the Holocaust, Mouse, Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, these and many other books have caught the attention of those who do not wish to have their children enjoy the complicated mixture of delight, taboo, and uncertainty that comes with reading any book that challenges our assumptions. Finally, a word about diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, which has been a defining feature of the international program from its establishment in 1967. We have hosted some 1,600 writers from 150 countries, and what they teach us is how little we know about other literary traditions and ways of being in the world. But every voice matters in the world of literature, that is, in the world, because it contains the possibility of opening our eyes to what we most need to hear and see. I date my own education in DEI to my close friendship with the poet Agha Shahid Ali, who described himself as a triple exile from Kashmir, from India, and from Urdu. He celebrated differences at every turn. He was the wittiest person I have ever known, flamboyantly gay, a Shia Muslim who liked to cook pork for his Jewish and Gentile friends. He was my oldest daughter's godfather, and when she was christened in the Episcopal Church, my wife asked him if he had any reservations about assenting to Anglican creeds. I take it all metaphorically, he said. He was the first poet I invited to read here at the International Writing Program when he was dying of the same form of brain cancer that had killed his mother 2 years before. And he recited his poems from memory, his eyesight having failed. He died the next year, and he was buried on Emily Dickinson's birthday in her hometown of Amherst, Massachusetts, which was also my birthplace. For as she wrote, success in circuit lies. Let Shahid have the last word, and this is his poem called Stationary. The moon did not become the sun. It just fell on the desert in great sheets, reams of silver handmade by you. The night is your cottage industry now. The day is your brisk emporium. The world is full of paper. Write to me. Thank you.
I am very pleased today to introduce Dr. Patricia Winokur, who is the Executive Dean of the Roy J. and Lucille A. Carver College of Medicine, as one of today's speakers. For me, Dr. Winokur is the exemplar of a physician scientist. She's passionate about her research, she's a creative individual, a strategic thinker, and she's driven to succeed. She brings these assets to her leadership role in the College of Medicine, but also to her research. Dr. Winokur is an expert in infectious diseases, and she has played a critical role in leading our vaccine trials here at Iowa, putting it in the national spotlight. Dr. Winokur's greatest contribution to the University of Iowa has been in her long-term leadership of the University of Iowa Vaccine Evaluation and Treatment Evaluation Unit. The person you're about to hear next is an individual who is a national and international leader in infectious diseases. We are most fortunate to be able to count her amongst our faculty, but also amongst our leadership.
So thank you, Donna. That was a wonderful introduction, and Donna has been a great friend and colleague for a number of years, so thank you. It's an honor to be here today to speak with such august speakers that preceded me, but also this is the 175th anniversary of the University of Iowa, and that's a pretty exciting time to think about. John Keller asked me to speak about COVID-19. I, of course, said, sure, I'm pretty comfortable with this topic. No problem. But every time I'm given a task to talk about COVID-19, the question is, how do you keep this fresh? We have become armchair quarterbacks, all of us. We can read the graphs, we can interpret the graphs, the CDC mask guidelines. What are we supposed to do today? How do you keep it interesting? Well, it was obvious. This is the 175th anniversary of the University of Iowa. Let's look at COVID-19 from the lens of history in Iowa. March 2020, the first case of COVID-19 hit the state of Iowa. We had been preparing in the University of Iowa hospitals and clinics for weeks. We had seen the devastation in Seattle. We had reconfigured wards to redevelop isolation wards. We had trained our intensive care physicians and nurses to care for patients that were critically ill. You can see in this slide, this is a patient that's being ventilated in a prone position. That's because you need to get the best oxygenation with these very damaged lungs that we see with COVID-19. The Board of Regents declared a state of emergency, and our students didn't come back from spring break. But have we seen this before? The answer is absolutely yes. In 1918, there was a pandemic of flu, the Spanish flu. It had swept the world. In October of 1918, flu patients had overrun the University of Iowa hospital isolation wards. We were housing patients in the now empty fraternity houses, the law building, the women's gym. Students were barred from classes, and the Iowa City Board of Health closed all public places. In 1918, we had masks. We had indoor ventilation. What does that mean? You open the windows to get more air. We had quarantining. We had bans on gatherings. Those were exactly what we had in March of 2020, not much more. For those of us that have studied vaccines, this was a pretty scary time because we didn't have a vaccine for coronaviruses. And we know it takes decades to create a vaccine. In this slide, if you look at the bottom bar, Ebola, this organism was identified in 1976. For 30 years, we studied the virus, the pathophysiology, the biology of this virus. And then we took another 15 to 20 years to develop vaccines that were tested in animals, eventually in humans. In 2019, we had the first vaccine approved for Ebola, 1976 to 2019. But we were a little bit lucky, if you can call that luck, in a pandemic. In 2002, we had the outbreak of the first coronavirus called SARS. It happened in Asia. It spread to Canada. It was a severe infection. People were dying of intense lung disease. It spread to healthcare workers, many of whom succumbed. but we were able to control that virus by locking down the wards, quarantining, and we were able to prevent the spread and the eventual, what could have been, pandemic of a coronavirus. In 2012, another coronavirus occurred. This was in the Middle East, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus. This too caused devastating pulmonary disease, but fortunately didn't develop the ability to pass person to person. We again were able to dodge a pandemic. But because we had these previous infections that were severe, a small number of investigators were interested in coronaviruses and thought this was an important thing to study. Two of those scientists are here at the University of Iowa. Stan Perlman is a pediatrician and microbiologist. He's been studying coronaviruses for 40 years. 40 years. He had learned about antibodies that were created to coronaviruses. They don't last very long, but he studied the T cells, the cell-mediated immune response. It's a little bit longer lasting. Paul McCrae, another pediatrician and pulmonologist, added his brains to the study of coronaviruses. Together, they created this mouse that expresses the human ACE2 receptor, the receptor that the coronaviruses bind to get into our human cells to cause the replication and eventual damage that we see. They put that mouse in a repository, and a few people around the world asked to borrow it and use it. This is Stan's citation index. If you look at Stan's career, it's been a great career. He's been studying coronaviruses for 40 years. He's often publishing 5 up to 10 papers a year. That's remarkable. Incredible productivity. You can see at the bottom, this dark blue line. These are the number of times people have cited his work. This is a really nice citation index. Each year, a few more people are citing his work. But look what happened in 2019. That is what happened. This is the benefit of persistence. He was passionate about coronaviruses. He believed this was important work. He went grant by grant studying coronaviruses. This is the tale of the importance of investing in science. It may not be the sexiest science. Probably during a lot of Stan's career, HIV was much more funded and fundable. But he believed in coronaviruses, and it paid off. While Stan was studying coronaviruses, there were a number of other scientists around the world that were studying messenger RNA. This work ended up learning that messenger RNA, if you put it in with cationic lipids, that could get the messenger RNA into cells where it could be translated into proteins. They learned that you could modify the nucleotides of the messenger RNA that would make it translatable. They could change how it was viewed by the human cell. Sometimes these foreign RNAs are considered invaders, and you mount a response to it. They learned how to encapsulate that messenger RNA in lipid nanoparticles that could protect the RNA. For RNA is a very volatile substance. It breaks down in minutes when it's not protected. All of those led to what we had around probably May of 2020, the first coronavirus vaccine. These are messenger RNA vaccines. Inside of the vaccine was the messenger RNA that expressed the spike protein. It was encased in this lipid nanoparticle that protected the RNA from being degraded before it could get into the cell. That lipid bubble was also important for helping it fuse to the cell membrane, allowing that messenger RNA to be deposited inside the cell. Once inside, it's picked up by ribosomes and translated into proteins. In this case, it's the spike protein. Work from Stan and a few others had proven how important that spike protein of coronavirus is in developing an immune response that can be protective. Once made, that spike protein is transferred to the cell surface, where then it's exposed to the immune system, and antibodies are made, and other cells that are very important in protecting us from disease. That's the first part of the science of vaccines. Someone has to create a vaccine. The second part is the science of translating that into human use. FDA looked at these vaccines and said, okay, if we're going to approve this vaccine, you're going to have to study 30,000 people. Half are going to have to agree to get placebo. All are going to have to agree to be followed for 2 years. The University of Iowa, for 20 years, we've been one of the country's premier vaccine testing sites. We've tested all sorts of vaccines for all sorts of diseases, often learning how to do these studies very quickly. We were able to get our studies up and running in 7 days, thanks to many in the university that got the contracts, the IRB approvals, all the things that we needed to get ready, started. We screened over 3,200 people to enroll 420 in several different COVID vaccine studies here at the University of Iowa. Our participants came from around the state. These were essential workers. They were workers at Hy-Vee, UPS drivers, teachers, healthcare workers, paramedics, all people that were keeping our country alive and working during this pandemic. When we got the data, it was flabbergasting. There was no guarantee. There are no messenger RNA vaccines that have ever been approved. We didn't know whether these vaccines would work. Our subjects who are part of these studies didn't know whether these vaccines would be safe. What we found was these vaccines were remarkably effective, 95% effective at preventing symptomatic COVID-19. But what was even better was they were just as effective in those that are 65 and older. Remember, this was a population that was devastated during this pandemic. The Pfizer vaccine was the first vaccine to be approved for emergency use. It was approved in December of 2020, less than 1 year after the identification of SARS coronavirus 2. Ebola, 1976 to 2019. COVID vaccines, 1 year. But the thing that's been really striking are the protests and social resistance. We have individuals that don't believe COVID-19 even exists. Many don't trust these vaccines. They've been so vocal that now we have a number of people around the country that don't believe in vaccines at all. Vaccines that we've had for decades that have proven to be safe. That's been distressing. If you look at this quote from Alexander Cho, he describes himself as being a digital anthropologist. What we're seeing is that digital acts as a magnifier, accelerator, an exacerbator of historical conduits of power that may have not been as obvious to folks before. Is that true? Well, let's look at history. In 1882, there was a smallpox outbreak in Keokuk, Iowa. Ironically, it was due to a medical accident. At that time, we had a vaccine. It was highly effective, but there was tremendous social resistance. Some residents reported that they'd already had smallpox. They didn't need that vaccine. Others argued that it was our civil liberty to refuse a vaccine. In response, the State Board of Health demanded that the public give vaccinators courteous treatment and allow them to enter into the work of vaccination at once. They were using none other than a bovine virus of the purest quality, trying to exhort the public that these vaccines had been purified and tested, and that we should allow those vaccines to be delivered. Sound familiar? This is a slide that shows how successful these vaccines have been, or half of a slide. What you can see on the left is the instance of COVID-19 infection during the Omicron wave, the last wave that we have today. Can you go back one slide? There you go. In the solid line, you can see unvaccinated individuals. In the dashed line, you can see those that have gotten 2 doses of vaccine. In the dotted line, you see those that got 2 doses and then 6 months later were boosted. These vaccines have been preventing infections very effectively. Yes, there's a little breakthrough. What you can't see on the right-hand side is that these vaccines have been almost completely preventing hospitalizations, especially when people have been boosted. So this is the time where you're going to have your infectious disease person telling you, go out and get that vaccine and get boosted. We are going to have another pandemic. Mother Nature has proven to be very effective at creating different strains. Right now, circulating in poultry populations in the eastern United States is a new avian strain of influenza. Maybe that's going to be the next pandemic. What we need are people that have that scientific passion like Stan. And this is a great story of Johann Holton, who got his master's and MD degree at the University of Iowa. He graduated in 1953. His master's degree was spent trying to grow viruses in the laboratory. It was kind of a new science then. And he was discussing this with his other colleagues. And they said, you know, boy, we really need to understand how the 1918 flu was so devastating. We need to grow that virus. And he thought back, he'd traveled to Alaska the year before. And as a pathologist, he thought about frozen tissues and how you could get tissues from people who'd succumbed from diseases. And he thought, you know, Alaska has the permafrost. Those individuals were probably buried deep into the earth in a territory where they haven't thawed since 1918. He took a small group of individuals, they went up to Alaska, and they talked to the Inuit villagers and asked them if they could exhume their ancestors. Oftentimes they were family members. And they were granted permission. They exhumed the bodies and did autopsies and got lung tissue, and they brought it back to Iowa. But he failed. He was unable to grow that virus. But he never gave up. He decided that he was still really interested in influenza, and he watched the literature and read scientific articles year after year. At the age of 72, he started seeing some remarkable findings in the literature of scientists that were able to use molecular biology to sequence different parts of viruses. And he was smart enough to know this may be the next chance to understand the 1918 influenza. He contacted the investigators that were doing this fancy molecular biology and said, if I could get you samples, would you use them? Would it be helpful? And they said, absolutely. He went back to Alaska, again talked to the Inuit villagers, and asked them if he could have the honor of helping the world. They said yes. He was able to bring samples back. They were sent to the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. 2005 began our understanding of these highly pathogenic flu viruses and the parts of the flu viruses that made them so virulent. That's persistence. That's what we try and teach our medical students today. Keep learning throughout your life. Innovation is critical. As we have endured this pandemic for 2 years, our clinical care teams have been changing their strategies day by day, figuring out how to get more people tested, how to do telemedicine, keeping our patients out of the hospital so that they're safe. Our educators switched immediately to online learning, and they did it with great innovation. We've learned a lot in the past 2 years, but there are many lessons that are here to come. You are going to be seeing messenger RNA vaccines tested for many other diseases. I can tell you that we're already starting to gear up for a flu vaccine that will be starting soon. We're trying to understand long hauler syndromes. Why are people having these symptoms for so long? We've learned a lot about social and health inequities. We're trying to figure out how to reduce those inequities. Many of you have seen the economic impacts. The economists among you, you need to study what's happened over the past 2 years, the supply chain issues, and prevent this in the future. We've seen social and political vulnerabilities, media and communications. Those of you that are experts need to figure out how can we get the best information to predominate and overcome some of that misinformation that has spread so readily over the past 2 years. Our educators, we switched when we had to, but now you need to figure out what parts do we keep and what's better in person. How do we do it better? There's plenty to learn. And I'd like to thank, there's so many people that I can thank for all of the 2 years that we've had and all the innovations, all the successes that we've had in caring for very, very sick patients. But I want to thank the research participants. They volunteered. They didn't know that this vaccine was going to be safe. They didn't understand whether it would work, but they gave themselves. In the 1950s, there was another vaccine, the polio vaccine, the Salk vaccine. It was tested in 1.5 million children. They ended up creating a pin called the Polio Pioneer pin. Many of those individuals have them today. You will be seeing soon that Pfizer has created a similar pin for those that participated in their studies, 42,000 of them. And finally, one other special thanks. This is my research team. We have been working nonstop, 24/7 for 2 years. We've studied vaccines, remdesivir, convalescent plasma, many different things besides vaccines. They have put a lot of effort in, and they have been proud to do it. So thank you.
kind of gave us a sense of where we've been and maybe where we're headed. So we so appreciate it. I have some questions for you, and I'll just throw out these questions, and I'd like to hear from each of you if possible. And if you want to dodge a question, just tell me no, like that, and I'll skip you. But I don't think any of these are too complex. So the first question that I always ask when I meet with students is, why are you in Iowa? Why did you come here? And I'd love to hear from each of you what brought you to the University of Iowa, and how has it been a good place for you to flourish? Some of you gave a little hint of that, but I'd like to hear more from you. Who'd like to start?
I'll start with that.
Thanks.
So I actually grew up in Iowa City. I went to junior high and high school here. So I left for college and medical school and did not actually ever think I would come back. But it was the quality of the internal medicine program here in the pediatrics program, because I did match with my husband, and it was that both of them were very highly ranked, and that's what brought us back. We left again, more training. We love training in medicine. We just keep going. But again, it was the high quality of the programs that brought us back.
Thank you, Pat. That's great. What's down next? Chris?
Well, I had not thought at all about Iowa. I was very happily teaching at the College of the Holy Cross, and I was researching a book about the Greek monastic republic of Mount Athos. And I called home. There were no cell phones on the Holy Mountain, and I knew I was on my way into about a 12-hour-long Orthodox Christmas vigil, and there was a payphone. So I called home, and my wife said, "You've got this really strange message from Iowa," and she said, "You ought to call them." And so I made another call on the payphone, and I thought that maybe they were going to invite me to give a reading or possibly teach for a semester, and it was to come and rebuild the international writing program. And I had 12 hours in that vigil to think about that instead of, the birth of Christ. And I came here, and I just found it to be so fascinating, and the chance to work with writers from around the world. It's just been endlessly interesting to me. And the funny thing is, I actually thought I would stop traveling when I came to Iowa, but boy, was I wrong about that.
Well, for me, I grew up in California and then spent a year in Huntsville, Alabama, then went to the University of New Hampshire, then to Munich, Germany, then back to New Hampshire. And then I found out about this position at Iowa and came here. And it's been just a remarkable place to be. I mean, this, as I spoke, is where it started. I mean, how can you not come work in my field and not want to be at the place? James Van Allen was still alive at that point. I used to chat with him. He was an interesting character. The story I always like to tell, just quickly, is we were coming up in the elevator once, and he would park on a loading dock, and they would drop off copies of the New York Times for the office. And so, trying to be clever, I had these in his hands. I said, "I bet you used to do that when you were a kid." And he came right back with, "Yeah, but I got paid for it then." So, this department is just where it's been for so many years that it's just been a remarkably good fit. And, we've had our ups and downs, but as I was saying, I think the future looks really great for us. We have a lot of good people, and we've really rebuilt our strength. So it's been a marvelous place to be. And the other part I'll say about Iowa, my wife's a professional musician. The balance for both of us here has been stunning, that you can be a professional musician and you can be a physicist, and you can both be, really filling out your career here, which is a remarkable thing.
Can I jump in and say something? This is what happens at Iowa. We had a wonderful Vietnamese writer in our program 10, 12 years ago who said, "Do you know of this man named James Van Allen?" And I said, "Yeah, he's one of our heroes." And he said, "Do you think he would let me interview him?" And I said, "Why not? Send him an email." And Jim sat down with him, and they conducted an interview, and that became the major part of the next book that this poet published in Vietnamese. These kinds of connections are always happening at Iowa.
I love that story. So each of you has, I think, demonstrated in your own ways how important interdisciplinary work is to what you do. I'm wondering if you'll speculate with us, and there are many scholars and academics in the audience, what is the future of interdisciplinary research and creative, interdisciplinary work look like to you? And is it going to be different here in Iowa than other places? So kind of a look forward to the future. What is interdisciplinary going to mean? What will it look like, and will it be different here than in other places? I can feel you want to answer this, Chris.
Well, I was just on a call with our research advisory board in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences talking about this very issue. And I think the best interdisciplinary research really comes from the ground up, when researchers find each other, and sometimes by happenstance. I've been collaborating with a colleague in electrical engineering who called a friend of hers at a place in Massachusetts and was asking about maybe a collaboration. They said, have you thought about going over to the physics department? And so I think that's how we really get it to grow, is helping researchers here on our campus find the others that are there, and then nurturing those collaborations when they happen. Because you already have 2, 3, 4 people, whatever, that have a common interest. And that way you can really grow the interdisciplinary research. I think it's harder to do it from the top down because you get people together that don't know each other, and it really takes, it's a mix of personal relationships and professional interests that make it go.
Thank you. Anybody else want to comment on what it's going to look like in the future and whether Iowa's different than anywhere else?
So I think, for medical research and scientific research, interdisciplinary approaches is absolutely critical, and you see that science is getting bigger and bigger, and you need engineering, you need all sorts of individuals that have different skills. But I think Iowa is a little different, and I think we're lucky that we're a little bit smaller, and we're a little bit more physically together. And I think that's made the collaborations easier to accomplish. I can walk across the river in 10 minutes and go see someone in person. That makes it much easier.
Thank you.
I'll follow with that too, because seeing those wonderful performances before our lectures this afternoon, the International Writing Program writers collaborate with the dance program and with the theater program. And my feeling has always been that this is a place where you can ask somebody if you want to get together and try something. People are generally willing to do it, and the proximity makes it easier. We have a wonderful writing program over in the medical college, and that seems quite natural.
Good. I was talking a little bit yesterday during the installation about being a big university with a small feel to it, and I think you're reflecting some of that. The other thing you've probably experienced when you visit other institutions is that if they get really big and they're in a metro area, people don't go to their offices as often, or they're commuting long distances. And I think in places like this, you can find people more readily and connect with them, right? So that's a part of what you're each speaking about. All right, here's another question. Is there a historical figure, and some of you talked about it, but I'll ask it again, associated with the University of Iowa who has inspired you in your work here? Besides James Allen. Craig.
Well, I'm trying to think, because that's the natural one to go to. I guess it's such a new field in many ways that you can't really say that it's that historical yet. I mean, literally, it's only been around since 1958 or so. But I think the people in our department that started these things off, beyond Van Allen, there's Carl McElwain, Don Gurnett, Lou Frank, folks that really brought this program into being, are the figures that inspire one, because they were all incredibly successful researchers. And Carl was actually my mentor at the University of California San Diego. He'd come there from here. And so in that sense, those are all folks that were Iowans. And of course, both Don and Lou were native Iowans. Carl was not, he was from Texas. But those folks, established strong research and strong imperatives to do well at that, and I guess that's the inspiration for me.
Great. Chris, you quoted a lot of people, but who's really inspired you?
I think today I've been recalling my dear friend Marvin Bell, who taught in the workshop for 40 years, and when the IWP went to celebrate its 40th anniversary, I had this crazy idea that I would bring together 6 other poets from 5 countries, and over the course of 4 days, we would write a book together. And the first poet I asked was Marvin, who didn't hesitate for a moment. Oh, yes, he wanted to be a part of that. And when we finished that project, he kept coming back to me and saying, we should do something else. And that led us to write prose poems back and forth for 10 years. And he was another generation above me. I was traveling around the world. He was largely between here and Port Townsend, Washington. But we had this connection that seemed to me to be entirely in the world of collaboration. And you know, he finished, the last one I sent to him was just a few days before he died. And his last email to me was, he said, this defines my immediate future, the thought of replying to what I'd written. And his last word to me was heartbreaking. And for me, it's been heartbreaking ever since that he's not a part of this, but his spirit is so much a part of everything that we do at the IWP.
Thank you. What about you, Pat?
You know, I think back more to the more immediate past, but there have been some unbelievable figures in the College of Medicine, and one of them is Frank Abood. Frank has been a dynamo throughout his career. He set Iowa, I think, into the limelight for a lot of the modern day kind of research that we have today. But others, Mike Apicella has been a personal mentor to me. I've had great collaborators, Catherine Challoner, Mike, and I had a wonderful project that we set together, each having their own area of expertise that allowed that project. But it's been remarkable. There are almost too many to account for.
Nice. Each of you has talked a little bit about, well, some of you have, I guess, maybe all 3 of you, about the younger people that we're attracting, either in your labs or in the writers program or in your classrooms, in your clinics. How do you think about mentoring? What's the key for you in terms of mentoring the next generation of presidential lecturers who are going to sit on this stage at some point in time? Chris?
That's an impossible question.
Go ahead, try it. I know you can answer.
But I guess I would think about, my mentor was a poet by the name of Brewster Giesland, who put together a book called The Creative Process, which has been in print steadily for 70 years. And what I always remember about him was he would take the time to go through many different drafts of poems that he'd written over any number of decades, and to show me the kinds of decisions he made at different points in the poem, in different drafts of the poem. And that was immensely useful to me, because I wasn't going to write poems like him, but the care that he showed to me makes me think that that's what mentoring can mean for the next generation of writers. Of course, most of the writers who come to the IWP are already so advanced that there's not much that I can offer them besides the time and the space to do their work, and then the chance to read it and share it with the world.
Lovely. What's the key to mentoring for you, Pat?
You know, I actually think the students are mentoring me all the time. They are always challenging us, and they're keeping us fresh. So it's just the ability to exchange ideas back and forth, and I think that's really inspiring. Giving them an opportunity, that's great, but they're on the way themselves.
Great. What about you, Craig?
Well, I guess I'd like to say, I think of myself as a fairly light touch mentor, that I think I try to develop students so that they think for themselves. Now and then you have to apply a little push here and there. One of my first, actually my very first student, started to go down a rabbit hole on something he was interested in. I said, Eric, remember, you're the one that wants to graduate and get married next summer. So maybe you should stop that and finish up this dissertation. So occasionally a little guidance like that. There's another piece of mentoring that I do in the classroom, and it's not direct, but I think just showing enthusiasm about what you are teaching is really important to show. You know, I have pre-health students, so people that want to be doctors and pharmacists and dentists, and I think they often think, you know, why do I have to take this physics class? And so I try to show them that there's there's a purpose to it. And in fact, actually this spring, I'll have an ophthalmologist friend come and show them why optics is actually important for ophthalmologists. And we've done this before, and it's really quite astounding when there's suddenly that aha moment of, oh, maybe I will actually use this stuff in my career. So there's kind of two different tiers of mentoring there.
You know, I have to jump in because I had a wonderful teacher, the poet William Matthews, who talked about teaching for a year here at the workshop. And he said, I just gave so many good ideas to every poet in the class, and at the end of the year I saw their poems getting published, and I saw that none of them took any of my advice, which is, for me, instructive.
Yeah.
All right, here's a question that wasn't on your list, but I want you to think about it. If you had the time and the ability to go back and pursue training in some other field right now that might augment your work, what would it be? Sorry, I didn't give you any warning about this question. Craig, I feel
Well,
you're
if it has
ready
to
to
augment
answer
my
that.
work, I have to think more about it.
Well,
I mean,
or not augment your work, just make you a more well-rounded individual.
oh, I go back and find some other experts to teach me better guitar playing.
Guitar playing.
I've
okay.
played music all my life, but I could certainly be a much better player than I am. So that would be, to study with some of the greats. And I've often thought, maybe in retirement, going to a place like Brazil and studying some of the forms that are taught there on guitar, which aren't quite the same as most of what I've learned. But I'd have to think about it for what other training I would like in my field.
Well, guitar playing is great. What about you, Chris? Have you anything?
You know, I have somebody who's been working on my staff for close to 20 years, Natasha Duravicheva, who is fluent in at least a dozen languages. And if I had 1/10 of her ability to take on other languages, that would have shaped my life in different ways as a writer, I think.
Interesting. What about you, Pat?
You know, today, computer sciences. It's not my area of expertise, and that's going to be the future, and it's certainly how a lot of our science is evolving.
So here's another question. We talk a lot at the university these days, or I do, about mental health and wellness and the importance of staying balanced. So you are all busy people. You're busy publishing, you're busy writing, you're busy in the labs, you're creating instruments that make no sense to the majority of us, I'm guessing. What do you do to keep yourself healthy and balanced? This is another question I didn't prep them with.
Well, that goes back to that guitar thing.
Yeah.
I find playing music, it's a different piece of your brain doing it. I'm a different group of individuals. I've done it throughout my career. Even when we were living in Munich, we formed a band with some people, and it's a different space to be in that kind of breaks one free of obsessing over one's work kinds of things. It also helps to be married to a fantastic wife like I am, who I've been together for a long time. That also helps with the whole stability.
That's great.
You should never ask a writer about mental health. I mean, that's
Something about cuckoos?
Oh, come on.
But I will say, I love the Wellness Center, and I'm there pretty early in the morning on the elliptical, and that's the space where I work out ideas about different issues I'm trying to address, and with any luck, I'm staying a little bit healthy by doing that.
Great, thanks. What about you, Pat?
Well, I'm trying to figure out what balance means personally, but I would say, and my husband probably would say that too, being outside. I think that for me is just seeing different parts of nature and seeing some fresh air, sunlight. Those are good things.
Yeah, I guess I would echo as part of that. We consciously move close enough to walk to work for me every day. And so I've done that my entire career here. And it makes a difference when you're just walking in the fall when the colors.
Or even in the winter when it's really cold out?
Yeah, they make these things called coats, it turns out.
That's great. So I think we probably have time for one more question. And, you know, each of you has sort of talked about issues in your work that are a little scary. Pandemics, the future of democracy, what the heck's going on in space. How do you stay optimistic about the future? What helps you as scientists and creative individuals to think about the future with optimism? Inspire us in that way, if you will. Chris?
As I was writing this lecture, which I actually pretty much tore up a few days ago when the war broke out in Ukraine and decided to go in a different direction. But one thing I kept thinking about was the poet Theodore Retke was once asked, what's the most interesting thing happening in American poetry? And he said, my next poem. And that's kind of where I am. I mean, you finish a poem or a work of prose, and you have this feeling of just being thrilled for in my case, less and less amount of time, maybe an hour. And then that old anxiety comes, and you're thinking, I didn't quite get that. I need to write, what's that next thing going to be? And that's what keeps me focused.
Good. Thank you. Pat, what about you? You had a, proclamation that the next pandemic will be coming. So how do you stay optimistic in the face of...
Look at what we did these past 2 years. How can you argue with that? That has been remarkable. And we've learned so much in these past 2 years. It'll be carrying forward. We're still here. That's good.
I love that. Craig?
One of the things that keeps me optimistic, and I've said this in various talks over the years, is the young people that we have here at the university. You know, you can go into the Java House in the back corner. There will be probably people arguing, passionately about some topic, or sitting out in the summertime, and that gives me great joy to see, because it's keeping alive this being passionate about things and learning and all the things that they're being exposed to here at the University of Iowa. And when I see things like that, I mean, how can you not be optimistic? That's human civilization going forward.
A lot of them are writing in the Java House.
Yep, well,
they're writing, that's right. Or getting ready to write, thinking about what they're going to write. That's terrific. Thank you. I think that's a perfect way for us to end, actually. We talk about students all the time, and I often tell the people that I work with, put me in a room with students for an hour, and I can completely turn my brain around and feel optimistic about the future, no matter what the crisis of the day is. So it is part of why these are such great opportunities to work in places like this university. You're surrounded by eager people who want to learn and who are going to make a difference in our future. So thanks to the students who are in the audience today, where you could be doing many other things, including going to a basketball game, but you're here, so we really appreciate that. And let's give a big round of applause to the students and to these amazing lecturers. So you'll have an opportunity, if you want to talk to any of them. We have a reception, which we're really excited about, just outside, and please join us for that. And we're also have a brief video that we're going to show that celebrates the University of Iowa's 175 years of innovation and excellence. Thank you all for coming today. Thank you.
For the people of Iowa, this building represents many things. A symbol of our pioneer roots, our great heritage, the cornerstone of the University of Iowa.
A place like the University of Iowa is as relevant today as it was when it was founded because of what it offers to the people of Iowa.
What makes Iowa special? We can work across departments and colleges. There really aren't barriers.
The vibrant activity that's going on here on the health arena, on the research arena, writing, communications, psychology. I mean, the energy here is endless.
The legacy of the school is considerable. First MFA program in the United States.
To the University of Iowa have come poets from all the world's areas.
Professor James Van Allen is really known as the father of scientific space exploration.
There'll be enormous implications on our intellectual and cultural life. The fact that we have always remembered our roots and that we continue to build on that is one of the things that will keep the University of Iowa strong.
The newest dormitory at Iowa is Birch Hall.
What you see is really an evolution of an institute that is dynamic, that moves with the times, and the people who move it, they are the people who take it there.
Education is Iowa's never-ending frontier. We're always moving forward.